At the banquet, my husband whispered to his mistress, "She's just a stepping stone." He forgot I was standing right behind him. The words slid into my chest like blades coated with poison. For a moment, I could not breathe, could not even blink. The world seemed to pause, as though the glittering chandeliers above held their breath with me. My hand tightened around the wine glass I was holding, and before I could stop myself, it slipped, shattering against the polished marble floor. Heads turned, conversations faltered, the music from the grand piano seemed to hush. But my husband, no, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, barely flinched. His eyes flickered to me for a second, then back to the woman at his side, his lips curving in a faint smile as if nothing had happened. I had never felt so small in my life. In that hall filled with hundreds of people, wearing a gown he had chosen for me, standing by the man I had sacrificed dreams for, I suddenly realized I was invisible. To him, I wasn't a partner. I wasn't a love. I was merely a tool, a stepping stone, on his path to power, money, status. My throat burned with unshed tears, but I swallowed them down. Not here, not now. I would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. I bent down, picked up the largest shard of the broken glass with steady hands, and set it on a passing waiter's tray. Then I stood tall, smiled faintly at the murmuring crowd, and walked away as though nothing had happened. Inside, however, I was crumbling. Every step felt like wading through fire. My heart screamed, begging me to demand answers, to confront him, to claw the smug expression off his mistress's face. But I didn't, because what would I gain? The betrayal was already complete. As I slipped out into the corridor, the noise of the banquet dimmed behind me, replaced by the pounding of my own pulse. My mind replayed his words again and again. Just a stepping stone. How many times had I heard him say I was his everything? How many nights had I stayed up editing his presentations, helping him prepare for crucial meetings, feeding him encouragement when he doubted himself? I had believed in him when no one else did. And tonight, in the very hall built to celebrate his so-called victory, he reduced me to nothing more than a rung on a ladder he was eager to climb. I leaned against the wall, staring at the floor, fighting the urge to sob. Memories flooded in, cruel in their timing. The night he first kissed me under the rain and whispered that he couldn't imagine a life without me. The evening he held my hand after my father's funeral, promising he'd always protect me. The day he asked me to marry him, sliding a ring on my trembling finger as I cried tears of joy. Had it all been a lie? Or had I been too blind to see the gradual cracks forming in our love? I remembered the endless sacrifices I made. The job offers I declined to follow him across cities. The career I placed on hold because he told me we couldn't both shine at the same time. The friendships I let slip away because he needed me by his side every moment. Slowly, without realizing, I had given him all of me, until there was nothing left but his shadow. And now, standing alone in that silent corridor, I realized the truth. I had been erasing myself for years. That night, I didn't return to the banquet. I went home, slipping out before anyone noticed. When he returned hours later, I pretended to be asleep. I heard the click of his shoes, the clink of his cufflinks as he set them on the dresser, the faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine drifting in the air. He didn't speak to me. He didn't even glance in my direction. He simply crawled into bed and turned his back to me. My tears soaked the pillow, silent and bitter. The days that followed were colder than winter. He came home less and less, and when he did, his presence was like ice, distant, irritable, impatient. He snapped at the smallest things, ignored my attempts to talk, and when our eyes did meet, his were empty, as though I had become a burden he could no longer tolerate. Yet I said nothing. I played the role of the dutiful wife, serving meals he hardly touched, washing clothes that smelled of places I had never been. I buried my pain, pretending normalcy, but inside, a storm was brewing. I had been reduced to a ghost in my own life. I cried alone in the shower where the water could hide my sobs. I sat by the window late at night, staring at the city lights, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I remembered the dreams I once had, the ambitions I abandoned. I had wanted to build something of my own, to leave a mark on the world. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that his success was mine too, that if he rose, we both rose. Now I saw the truth. He had used my devotion, my sacrifices, my quiet labor, and passed them off as his brilliance. He had climbed, yes, but he had climbed on me. And I was done letting him. One evening, I sat before the mirror in our bedroom, staring at the reflection of a woman I hardly recognized. My eyes were swollen, my skin pale, my lips pressed in a line of defeat. But beneath the exhaustion, I saw something else, a glimmer. It was faint, but it was there. A spark that whispered, "You are not finished. You are not powerless." I touched the mirror with trembling fingers and whispered to myself, "He called you a stepping stone. Then become the stone that builds your own empire." That night, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My old mentor, the one who had once told me I had the mind of a leader. Back then, I had laughed, brushing it off. I was in love, and love was enough. But when he answered and I heard his warm, steady voice, the tears fell again, not of weakness but of release. "It's not too late," he told me. "The best revenge isn't destruction. It's transformation." Let him see the woman he tried to bury rise higher than he could ever dream. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. A small, broken smile, but real. My heart was still wounded, my nights still haunted by betrayal, but something inside me shifted. I realized I had been silent too long. I had allowed myself to be diminished, erased. But not anymore. From that night forward, I began quietly rebuilding myself. Every morning, I woke before dawn and wrote plans, goals, strategies. I reached out to people I had once helped, rekindling connections I had neglected. Slowly, I stitched together the pieces of myself I had lost. My husband didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't care. Either way, his neglect gave me space to rise in the shadows, just as I once had risen him. He thought I was weak. He thought I would stay, tolerating his betrayal, clinging to the scraps of affection he no longer offered. But he was wrong. I was no longer the woman who shattered in silence at a banquet. I was becoming someone else, someone stronger, sharper, unstoppable. And in the quiet of those nights, when I sat at the window watching the city breathe, I whispered a promise to myself, I will never be just a stepping stone again. The battle was only beginning. They said the banquet would be grander than the last one, but this time, I wasn't walking in as a wife hidden in the shadows. I was walking in as the guest of honor. The chandelier lights glistened above me, brighter than I remembered. The air carried the same perfume of wealth, of power, of whispered alliances. Yet everything felt different, because a year ago, I had walked into this hall clinging to the role of a silent supporter. Tonight, I stepped in as the keynote speaker, my name printed in gold across the program, my presence requested, my voice anticipated. I wore confidence like a gown, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each step announcing a new version of me. The woman who had once swallowed betrayal and hid her tears was gone. In her place stood someone forged from heartbreak and rebuilt with purpose. I carried no bitterness in my smile, no tremor in my hands. Only strength, calm, and the quiet knowledge that I had risen from the ashes of a marriage meant to diminish me. As I glanced across the crowded room, I saw him, my ex-husband. He wasn't the towering figure I remembered. The weight of arrogance no longer cloaked him in confidence, instead, he seemed smaller somehow, strained, with lines etched around his eyes. Rumors had reached me months ago that his company had begun to falter, that the same people who once cheered his name had turned their backs when his brilliance proved shallow without my hidden hand supporting it. Standing beside him was the same mistress, her grip on his arm tight, her gaze flicking nervously around the room as though afraid someone might dismiss her. Our eyes met. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of disbelief in his stare, followed by something I couldn't name, regret, perhaps. But I did not let my gaze linger. He was no longer the center of my story. Tonight was about me, about the woman I had become. When my name was announced, applause rippled through the hall. I walked to the stage, every step steady, the echoes of my heels like drums marking the rhythm of my rebirth. Standing behind the podium, I looked out at the sea of faces, investors, partners, visionaries, all waiting. A year ago, these very walls had swallowed my silence. Tonight, they would carry my voice. I began with a story. Once, I said, letting my voice resonate, there was a woman who was told she was just a stepping stone. That her value was only in helping someone else rise. And for a long time, she believed it. She gave her everything, her time, her love, her dreams, thinking that if he rose, they would both rise. But she was wrong. He climbed, and she was left behind, broken. Until one day, she realized stepping stones may be walked on, but they are also what help you cross rivers. And some stepping stones, if you look closely, are not stones at all, they are the beginnings of mountains. The hall was silent, every eye stayed fixed on me, every breath seemed held in suspense. I let the words sink in before I continued. That woman rebuilt herself. She rose from betrayal, from abandonment, from invisibility. And tonight, she stands here before you, not as someone's shadow, not as someone's stepping stone, but as her own. My name is, I spoke my name clearly, firmly, and the applause that followed rolled through the hall like thunder. I didn't look at my ex-husband directly, but I felt his stare burn into me. It no longer unsettled me. Instead, it fueled me. I spoke of my journey, how I had taken the knowledge and experience I once poured into his dreams and built something of my own. I described the vision behind my company, an empire that valued integrity, one that gave voice to those too often overlooked, one that turned sacrifice into strength. I spoke of resilience, of betrayal transformed into fuel, of loss that became the soil for rebirth. Every word carried not just my story, but the story of countless people who had been told they were less, who had been silenced, diminished, or discarded. I gave them a voice through mine, and the applause that followed wasn't just for me, it was for everyone who had ever been broken and dared to rise again. When I stepped down from the stage, people crowded around me. They shook my hand, offered partnerships, praised my courage. Cameras flashed, voices overlapped, but through it all, I remained composed. Inside, however, my heart beat with something I hadn't felt in years, pride. Not the pride of being attached to someone else's success, but the pride of owning my own. Across the room, I saw him again. My ex stood still, apart from the crowd, watching. He looked diminished. His mistress whispered something to him, tugging at his sleeve, but his eyes remained locked on me. Finally, as the crowd around me thinned, he approached. His steps were slow, hesitant, as though each one weighed heavily on him. "You've changed," he said softly when he reached me. His voice held none of the arrogance I remembered, none of the dismissiveness. For a fleeting second, I saw the man I once loved, the one who had held me in the rain, who had promised me forever. But that man was gone, buried beneath the choices he made. "No," I replied, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I haven't changed. I just stopped being who you needed me to be and became who I was always meant to be." His jaw tightened. Regret flickered again, but he didn't speak. His mistress tugged his arm once more, impatience written on her face. Finally, he turned, and together they slipped away, swallowed by the crowd. Watching them go, I felt nothing. No anger, no pain. Only closure. Later that night, as the banquet emptied and the chandeliers dimmed, I stood alone near the very spot where my heart had shattered a year ago. I closed my eyes and breathed in the silence. The ghosts of that night no longer haunted me, they had become the stepping stones of my transformation. Walking out into the night air, I lifted my head to the city skyline. The lights sparkled like stars, and for the first time in a long time, I felt light, free. I realized then that betrayal hadn't destroyed me, it had remade me. That the cruelest words I had ever heard, just a stepping stone, had become the fuel for my rise. I whispered into the cool night air, not to him, but to myself, to the woman who had once cried silently in the dark, "You did it. You rose. You became everything they said you couldn't be." And that was the truth I carried forward, the truth I wanted the world to know: never let anyone define your worth. Because when someone calls you just a stepping stone, you can choose to stay beneath their feet, or you can rise, build, and become the very ground others dream of standing on. That night, I didn't just leave the banquet hall. I left behind every trace of who I had been when I first entered it. I stepped into the future, no longer a shadow, no longer a stone, but a mountain.